The rain on the roof of the last chapter bookstore was a soft, consistent rhythm, a lullaby Cassandra Reed had learned to find peace in. It was a far cry from the percussive, violent storms of the Amalfi Coast, and she was grateful for the difference every single day. Here, in this mist-shrouded corner of the Pacific Northwest, the weather was a blanket, not a drama. She moved through the familiar twilight of the shelves, her fingers trailing over spines with the quiet affection of a curator in a museum of quiet lives. The scent of old paper, binding glue, and the faint, lingering note of her chamomile tea was the perfume of her freedom. It was a scent she'd constructed, molecule by molecule, over 5 long years. To anyone else, it was just a bookstore. To her, it was a cathedral, and every well-thumbed paperback was a hymn to her anonymity. Her evening ritual was sacred. She flipped the wooden sign on the door to "closed," the click of the latch a satisfying seal against the world. She counted the modest till, the numbers mundane and comforting. Then, the final act, the encrypted message to Gabby. A single word, shelved, sent from a burner device that lived in a Faraday cage beneath a floorboard. It meant, "I am safe. The day is done. You are safe." The reply, bound, came moments later. "I am safe. We continue." Only then did her shoulders drop a fraction, the invisible armor she wore from waking moment until this one finally allowed to creak and loosen. The bell above the door jingled. It was a sound so alien at this hour, so violently out of place, that for a second, she simply froze, the ledger in her hands. The rain had masked the approach. No one in this town came by after hours, they respected the rhythm of the place. She turned, a polite, customer service smile already forming on her lips, ready to explain they were closed. The smile died. The air left her lungs as if she'd been struck in the chest. He stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from the hem of his long, black coat, pooling on the worn oak floorboards. 5 years. 5 years had carved him, hardening the youthful intensity into something weathered and immovable. His face was all sharp planes and shadows under the weak, warm glow of the pendant light, but his eyes were exactly the same. A liquid darkness that had once promised her a world beyond gilded cages, and had instead become the instrument of its absolute collapse. Dante. Not the Dante of her whispered dreams or her screaming nightmares, but a solid, breathing artifact of a past she had buried. "We're closed," she said, her voice a stranger's, flat and brittle. He didn't move to leave. His gaze swept over her, the simple sweater, the jeans, the hair loosely tied back, the lack of the diamonds and severity that had once been her uniform. The appraisal was swift, merciless. "Cassandra," he said, and her new name in his mouth felt like a violation. He took a step forward, and the world of her bookstore seemed to shrink, the shelves pressing in. "It's a quiet life you've built. It suits you. Get out." The command trembled. "I wish I could." He sounded genuinely weary, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were agent's eyes now, assessing, calculating. He reached inside his coat, and her body coiled, years of instinct screaming. But it wasn't a weapon he withdrew. It was a manila envelope. He let it fall onto the counter between them with a soft, damning thud. "Open it." Her hands were ice. She didn't want to touch it, as if its contents were contagious. But the part of her that was still Chiara Rossi, the part that knew survival was paramount, compelled her fingers to break the seal. Photographs spilled out. Gabby, laughing at an outdoor cafe in Lisbon. Gabby entering her apartment building. Gabby walking on a beach, her face turned to the sun, blissfully unaware of the long lens that had captured her. The last photo was a screen grab of a familiar, secure chat log, *log, with location metadata highlighted in red. A cold, sickening terror, deeper than any she had felt even in her father's house, flooded her veins. Gabby was her tether, her only link to a self that wasn't entirely fabricated. Her safety was the non-negotiable cornerstone of this entire fragile existence. "If you've hurt her," her voice was a low, venomous thing. "I haven't," Dante said, cutting her off. His tone was clinical, the voice of a man presenting a mission brief. "But the moment you refuse to come with me, a different packet goes to a certain address in Naples. One phone call from your brother Enzo, and Gabriel Silva disappears forever. Not into witness protection. Into the ground." The trap was exquisite in its cruelty. He hadn't come with threats against her, she'd proven she was willing to die to escape. He'd come with the one thing she could not sacrifice. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, the wood biting into her palms, the only anchor in a room that was starting to spin. "Come with you where?" she whispered. "Home." The word was a blasphemy. She shook her head, a frantic, animal denial. "No. Never. I am dead to them." "You will be resurrected," he stated, as if discussing a logistical puzzle. "The Rossi Syndicate is making a move, a deal with the Cartel de las Sombras. My task force has a window, but we need an insider they will trust. Someone only you can be." A hysterical laugh choked in her throat. Trust asterisk? They'll tear me apart the second I walk through the door. Enzo will skin me alive just for the fun of it. You'll have a cover story. You'll have me. Her eyes snapped to his, and all the shattered pain of 5 years ignited into white-hot fury. You, who held my face and told me you'd chosen me, only to leave me waiting on a dock in the dark while you called my father's guards? You, whose betrayal was the final proof that love is just a weapon you people haven't yet learned to fire. I would rather walk into my father's house alone than stand next to you for a second." For the first time, a crack appeared in his impassive facade. A flicker in that dark gaze, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. It wasn't regret she saw, it was something harder, more desperate. "What I did that night," he said, each word measured, "was the only way to keep you from becoming your brother. To keep you from being pulled so deep into an operation you couldn't see the sides that there would have been no getting out. They were closing in. It was cut you loose or watch you drown. You didn't cut me loose, Dante. You handed me the anchor." The old hurt was a physical presence, a specter in the room between them. "You made me believe, and then you used that belief to destroy me. So you can take your mission and your moral calculus and get out of my shop." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward, planting his hands on the counter, invading the last remnants of her space. The scent of him, cold rain, leather, and that faint, indefinable spice that was so uniquely his, was an assault. "This isn't a request, Chiara. It's an ultimatum. You come with me willingly, you play your part, and when the syndicate falls, you and Gabby get wiped cleaner than before. New names, new lives, a real goodbye. Or," he paused, letting the alternative hang in the silent, book-lined air, "I walk out that door and make the call to Naples. Enzo has been so bored since you left. He'll relish the hunt." She stared at him, seeing the boy she loved buried under the agent, seeing the ghost of the man she'd hoped he was smothered by the ruthless pragmatist he'd become. There was no choice. There had never been a choice, not from the moment he'd crossed her threshold. The freedom of the last 5 years had been an illusion, a beautiful, fragile loan that was now being called due, with lethal interest. The fight drained from her, leaving a hollow, cold certainty. She looked around at her bookstore, at her quiet, hard-won sanctuary. She had built it to be a tomb for Chiara Rossi. Now, she would have to make it one for Cassandra Reed, too. "Give me the file," she said, her voice empty of everything. "The cover story. The parameters." A silent victory, but no relief, showed in his eyes. He slid another, thinner folder from his coat. She took it, her movements mechanical. Then she walked to the back room, to the small sink. From the cupboard below, she retrieved a red gasoline can she used for the lawnmower. Without a word, she began to methodically pour it along the base of the shelves, over the desk, across the beautiful rug. The acrid smell filled the air, cutting through the scent of paper and peace. Dante watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" "What has to be done," she replied, not looking at him. Cassandra Reed could not simply vanish. A ghost needed a grave. She took a matchbook from the counter, the one from the diner down the street she sometimes visited. She struck a single match, the flare of light illuminating her face, a face that was once again Chiara's, hard and resolved. She dropped it. The flame caught with a soft whump, racing along the gasoline trail, climbing the shelves, hungrily consuming the stories that had been her shelter. The heat bloomed, pushing against the damp chill from the door. She stood watching for a moment, the firelight dancing in her eyes, a funeral pyre for the woman she had tried so hard to be. Then she turned, walked past Dante without a glance, and stepped out into the cold, relentless rain. She did not get into the passenger seat of his waiting car. She stood beside it, waiting, until he came and opened the door for her. A small, bitter gesture of control. As she slid inside, the smell of smoke clinging to her clothes, she took one last look at the burning heart of her old life. The car pulled away, the windshield wipers beating a steady, mocking rhythm. She was not Cassandra. She was barely even Chiara anymore. She was a weapon being loaded back into the chamber, and the man beside her, his hand steady on the wheel, was the finger on the trigger. The road ahead was dark, winding, and led only back to the underworld. The rain that had been a constant companion on the drive north did not let up as they reached the safe house. It was a different kind of rain here, in this remote corner of the Washington coast, not a gentle Pacific Northwest mist, but a needling, horizontal assault driven in from the sea, lashing the windows of the bleak, modular structure that seemed to cling to the rocky cliffs out of sheer spite. Inside, the air was sterile and cold, smelling of industrial cleaner and damp concrete. It was not a place for living, it was a place for planning, for deconstruction, a surgical theater where Cassandra Reed would be carefully dissected until only Chiara Rossi remained. The first incision was made by Agent Talia Vance. She arrived within the hour, a silhouette of sharp angles and efficient motion in a tailored pantsuit that seemed to reject the very concept of the surrounding gloom. She carried a tablet like a scepter, and her eyes, when they settled on Chiara, held no warmth, no sympathy, only a calculating appraisal of viability and risk. "You'll be processed in Naples," Vance began without preamble, spreading satellite images and dossier photos across a steel table. "A Rossi lieutenant, a man named Silas, frequents a café in the Spanish Quarter. You will be there, looking lost and desperate. He will recognize you. Your story is one of prolonged trauma, kidnapped by a rival faction for leverage, held in isolation, your escape a recent, harrowing ordeal facilitated by a sympathetic guard." Vance's tone was that of a director blocking a scene. "The physical evidence, malnutrition, the minor scars we will provide, will sell the narrative. Your psychological state will be your greatest asset. Withdrawal, flashes of terror, dissociation. You are a wounded bird returning to the only nest you know." Chiara listened, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling the ghost of her bookstore's warmth being leached away by the clinical chill of the room. "And him?" she asked, her gaze flicking to Dante, who stood by the window, a silent sentinel watching the storm. "Where does he fit in this narrative?" Vance allowed a thin smile. "Viper is the one who found you. He has contacts in the Balkan underworld. The story will be that whispers of a tortured Italian woman reached him, and his instincts, or perhaps his old loyalties, prompted him to investigate. He brings you home, a prize to curry favor with the Don. It's a credible gambit for a man of his ambition." "And our history?" The words tasted like ash. "He was my lover. Then he vanished. You expect my father, my brother, to believe we just stumbled back into each other's orbits without complication." This time, Dante turned from the window. "They'll believe the complication," he said, his voice low. "They'll believe the tension. We don't pretend it doesn't exist. We weaponize it. Viper sees an opportunity. Chiara sees the man who broke her heart. The push and pull is what makes it real." Vance nodded. "Exactly. The emotional verisimilitude will be your cover. You are to rehearse it. Now." What followed was a form of exquisite psychological torture. Under Vance's dispassionate eye, they were forced to resurrect their past, not as a cherished memory, but as a script. They had to articulate the timeline of their old affair, the stolen moments in sun-drenched vineyards, the whispered conversations in Palazzo Gardens, the electric, forbidden thrill of it. Chiara had to describe, in flat, monitored tones, the depth of her trust, the future she had painted in her mind. Dante had to counter with Viper's calculated seduction, the necessary steps to embed himself deeper into the Rossi inner circle. Each shared detail was a scalpel, reopening wounds that had never truly healed, sanitizing something that had once felt sacred into a series of tactical maneuvers. "And the night on the dock?" Chiara asked, her eyes locked on Dante's, challenging him to say it in front of his handler. Dante's jaw tightened. Viper received orders. The task force was moving on a separate cell. Maintaining his cover required a demonstration of ultimate loyalty to the syndicate. Sacrificing the relationship was strategically necessary. "Sacrificing," Chiara repeated, the word hollow. "You make it sound like a chess move." "It was," Vance interjected smoothly. "And it will be again. The emotional stakes are the groundwork. Your family will be watching for every flicker, every unresolved current." Give it to them. Let them think they understand the dynamic. Let them believe they can use it. The rehearsals bled into days, the relentless rain a fitting soundtrack. They practiced in the barren living area, circling each other like wolves. Dante, as Viper, would deliver a line with a cold, possessive intensity. Chiara would respond with a flinch that was only half feigned, a surge of old betrayal flashing in her eyes that required no acting at all. Sometimes, the lines blurred. A touch meant to guide her into position would linger, his thumb brushing the inside of her wrist, and for a fractured second, the sterile room would vanish, replaced by the scent of lemon trees and sea salt. Then she would yank her arm back, the mask of icy contempt slamming down, and see not Viper, but the Dante who had left her in the dark, his own eyes reflecting a pain that seemed just as real as hers. The final rehearsal was the worst. Vance had left them to run through the reunion scene, the moment Viper presents the lost princess to her family. Dante approached, not as her drill instructor, but as himself, his voice stripped of its agent's cadence. "When I see you there, after all these years," he said, the words quiet, meant only for her, "it won't be an act, Chiara. The regret, it's the truest thing I carry." She wanted to scream, to shatter the window and let the storm swallow them both. Instead, she met his gaze, her own voice a whispered blade. "Then use it. But remember, your regret is my contamination. Don't expect me to forgive the poison just because you finally admit what it is." The flight to Italy was a silent, pressurized tube of dread. They traveled under false passports, a disconnected, wealthy couple. He slept, or pretended to. She stared out the window at the boundless, indifferent clouds. The descent into Naples was a violent jerk back into reality. The chaotic buzz of the city, the vibrant, shouting life of it, was a sensory assault after the quiet of her small town and the sterility of the safe house. It smelled of diesel, espresso, salt air, and a faint, ever-present undercurrent of decay, the smell of her childhood, of her prison. The insertion went with a chilling, clockwork precision. Silas, the lieutenant, was a man whose face she recalled from the periphery of her old life, a sharp-eyed weasel of a man, loyal only to opportunity. She sat at the café, wearing clothes meant to look donated, her hair deliberately lank, her hands trembling around a tiny cup of espresso she had no intention of drinking. She let her gaze go hollow, let the profound exhaustion she felt radiate from her pores. When Silas's shadow fell across her table, his double-take was almost comical. The shock in his beady eyes was quickly smothered by avaricious calculation. Asterisk the princess. Lost. A ticket straight to the Don's favor asterisk. Her rescue was a blur of staged confusion and Viper's imposing, controlled presence. He handled Silas with a mix of threat and promise, his authority absolute. Then, the car ride to the villa. The familiar, winding road up the cliff face towards the Rossi's fortified compound was a journey back through time, each curve pulling her deeper into a past she had mourned and buried. The massive, iron-gated entrance, the cypress trees standing like sentinels, the severe, pale stone of the building itself, it was not a homecoming. It was an incarceration. The great hall was just as she remembered, cavernous, opulent, cold. Marble floors echoed underfoot. A massive fresco of some mythic battle dominated the ceiling, a constant, silent reminder of violence as legacy. And there, waiting, were the architects of her life. Marcello Rossi did not rise from his throne-like chair. He simply watched as she was led in, his eyes the color of flint, missing nothing. The years had added a dignified silver to his temples but had only deepened the lines of ruthless command around his mouth. He was a statue of contained power. To his right, leaning against the mantel with predatory ease, was Enzo. Her brother had thickened, his once handsome face now coarsened by suspicion and cruelty. A jagged scar, new to her, traced from his brow to his cheek, a testament to the violent life he embraced fully. The silence was heavier than any accusation. It was Enzo who broke it, pushing off the mantle with a slow, deliberate movement. He circled her, a shark scenting blood. "Look what the tide washed in," he murmured, his voice a silk-covered razor. "A ghost. Or a very clever imitation." "Enzo," Marcello said, a single word that was both a caution and a permission to continue. Enzo stopped in front of her, so close she could smell his expensive cologne and the faint, metallic scent that always seemed to cling to him. 5 years, sister. And you emerge from the shadows now, on the arm of Viper, of all people." His eyes cut to Dante, who stood a respectful pace behind her, radiating a respectful but dangerous stillness. A compelling story. A tragic one. I find I have a skepticism for tragedies. They so often contain convenient lies. He reached out, not to strike her, but to take a lock of her hair between his fingers, rubbing it as if testing the quality of a fabric. Chiara forced herself not to recoil, to keep her breathing even, to let the terror she felt show openly, the terror of the victim, not the deceiver. She let a tear track through the carefully applied dirt on her cheek. They kept me in the dark, Enzo, she whispered, letting her voice break precisely as she and Vance had practiced. For so long? I didn't know if it was day or night. Marcello finally spoke, his gaze bypassing her entirely to land on Dante. Viper. You have done the family a great service. Recovering lost assets is valuable work. Your reward will be commensurate. Leave us now. We must reacquaint ourselves with my daughter. It was a dismissal and a test. Dante's eyes met Chiara's for a fleeting moment, a flash of something fierce and warning, before he gave a curt, respectful nod to Marcello and turned on his heel. The sound of his retreating footsteps was the sound of her only tether to the present being severed. She was alone in the lion's den, with the lions who had raised her. Enzo's reacquaintance was an interrogation that lasted deep into the night. It was not conducted in the hall, but in a small, soundproofed study lined with ledgers, not books. He asked about her captivity, probing for inconsistencies, his questions laced with traps. He demanded specifics about her captors' accents, their habits, the food she was given, the layout of imaginary rooms. He watched her eyes, her hands, the pulse at her throat. She fed him the fabricated details, weaving them with genuine fragments of sensory memory from her 5 years of hiding, the feel of a damp wall, the taste of stale bread, the sound of distant traffic, until the lie took on the texture of truth. When her answers held, he shifted tactics. He spoke of Dante. He was your weakness once. I remember the way you looked at him. Like a stupid little girl. Do you imagine he looks at you now with anything but calculation? He sells you to our father to buy more power. You are a transaction to him, Sorellina. Always were. She absorbed the blows, letting them land, using the genuine pain they caused to fuel her performance of shattered resignation. What does it matter, she finally breathed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. There is no part of me left that believes in anything. I am just tired. It was that display of broken spirit, more than any perfect detail of her story, that seemed to satisfy him for the moment. He dismissed her to the care of a silent, stern maid who led her to her old room. It had been preserved, a museum of the girl she had been, the lavish furnishings, the wardrobe of haute couture, the view of the moonlit bay that had once felt like a promise and now felt like the bounds of a gilded cage. The door locked from the outside. Alone, the performance fell away. The trembling that started in her hands became a full-body quake, a seismic release of fear and adrenaline. She sank to the floor, her back against the ornate door, gasping for air that felt too thick, too perfumed. She had walked back into the belly of the beast, and the beast had recognized her, not as kin, but as prey that had foolishly returned. Hours later, she didn't hear the lock turn. She simply felt the draft first, then saw his shadow fall across the moonlit floor. Dante stood in the doorway, his face obscured in darkness. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't speak. He just crossed the room, knelt before her where she sat huddled on the floor, and pulled her into his arms. It was not an embrace of lovers. It was the desperate clutch of two survivors pulled from the same wreckage. For a moment, she buried her face in his shoulder, the solid reality of him a barrier against the overwhelming horror of the villa. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. She could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her own. Then, the memory of Enzo's words, *a transaction*, flashed like lightning in the dark of her mind. The warmth curdled into fury. This was part of the act, too. This comfort, this shared pulse of fear, it was just another layer of the manipulation. She shoved against his chest, breaking the contact as if scalded. "Don't," she hissed, scrambling back until she hit the bed frame. "Don't you dare. You handed me back to them. You sat in that hall and you left me with him." He remained on his knees, his breathing ragged. "I had to. You held. You were perfect. I am not your asset to commend." The whisper was violent, tearing from her throat. Your touch, it still feels like a lie. Get out. Get out of my room. He rose slowly, his silhouette tall and filled with a tense anguish. He didn't argue. He just looked at her, a long, silent look that seemed to hold all the words they couldn't afford to say. Then he turned and left, the lock clicking back into place with a finality that echoed in the hollowed-out core of her. She was alone again, the ghost in the machine of her own past, and the game, she understood with a chilling clarity, had only just begun. The real performance started tomorrow. Sleep, in the gilded cage of her old room, was an impossible abstraction. It was not a state of rest but a shallow, feverish limbo where the rehearsed lies of the day tangled with the sharp, visceral memories that every object in the room provoked. The damask wallpaper whispered of teenage loneliness. The vanity mirror reflected the ghost of a girl being taught how to apply lipstick like war paint. The faint, lingering scent of the gardenia perfume her mother had favored was a funeral bouquet in the still air. Chiara spent the night not sleeping, but performing a silent, solitary autopsy on the person she had been, preparing the remains to be worn as a disguise. Dawn arrived not with hope, but with a summons. It was not her father or her brother who sent for her, but the silent, stern maid, who led her not to the breakfast terrace, but to the south wing of the villa, her father's private domain. The hallways here were narrower, darker, lined not with art but with framed maps of territories, shipping lanes, and faded photographs of men with severe expressions. It was the architecture of power, cold and unadorned. The maid stopped before a heavy, polished door, knocked once, and retreated, leaving Chiara alone. Marcello's study was a sanctum of controlled menace. The massive desk was clean but for a single, antique dagger used as a letter opener and a closed leather portfolio. The walls were lined with books, but they were uniform, legal-looking volumes, their spines uncreased. He stood at the window, his back to her, looking out over the terraced vineyards that rolled down to the sea, an empire in miniature. "You will prove your loyalty," he said, without turning. His voice was calm, conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Today. There is a man in one of the holding cells below the wine cellar. A Sicilian, from a family that thought they could encroach on my port fees. He has outlived his usefulness as a source of information." Chiara's blood turned to ice in her veins. She knew what those cells were. She had never seen them, but as a child, she had heard stories, whispers of sounds that were blamed on the ancient plumbing. She forced her expression to remain placid, a mask of weary acceptance. Marcello finally turned. His flint-colored eyes pinned her. "You will go down there. Viper will accompany you. You will take a gun. And you will execute him. A demonstration that your ordeal has not softened you. That the Rossi blood still runs true, and cold, in your veins." It was a test, of course. But its purpose was multifaceted. It tested her obedience. It tested her stomach for the family business. And, most diabolically, it tested the dynamic between her and Dante. Would the hardened enforcer balk at forcing the traumatized princess? Would she break? Would he? She was given no time to protest, to prepare. The maid reappeared and escorted her back through the labyrinthine halls, downward this time, past the bustling kitchens and into the deep, cool underbelly of the villa where the vintage wine slept in dusty racks. At the end of a particularly dark corridor was an unmarked iron door. Dante was already there, leaning against the stone wall, his arms crossed. In his hand, held loosely by the barrel, was a sleek, black 9mm pistol. Their eyes met. No words passed. In his gaze, she saw the cold resolve of Viper, the agent following the script to maintain his cover. But beneath it, in the almost imperceptible tension around his mouth, she saw the ghost of Dante screaming in silent torment. He was handing her the instrument of her moral annihilation, and he was doing it on her father's orders. The symmetry of the betrayal was brutal. He pushed off the wall and opened the heavy door. The smell that wafted out was of damp stone, stale sweat, and a coppery hint of old blood. A short flight of steps led down to a single, bare cell illuminated by a single, bare bulb. A man, middle-aged, his face bruised and his clothes stained, sat on a wooden bench. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening first in fear, then in a dawning, horrific recognition as they settled on Chiara. "La Principessina," he breathed, the title a curse and a plea. Dante pressed the gun into Chiara's hand. The metal was shockingly cold. Her fingers curled around the grip by instinct, the weight of it both alien and terrifyingly familiar from childhood lessons she had tried to forget. "Do it," Dante said, his voice devoid of inflection, echoing in the small, hard space. "Clean. In the forehead. The dawn is waiting." The man began to pray, the rapid, desperate words of the rosary tumbling from his split lips. Chiara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape its cage. She looked from the terrified man to the impassive face of Dante, who gave a minute, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't encouragement. It was an instruction. "Perform." She raised the gun, her arm trembling not from weakness, but from the sheer, catastrophic tension between the person she was and the person she had to become. The man squeezed his eyes shut. The prayer became a whisper. In that suspended second, Chiara's mind, honed by years of survival and sharpened by recent desperation, raced through possibilities. A refusal meant death for her, probably for Gabby, and the end of the mission. A killing would murder something in her that could never be resurrected. She shifted her stance, a subtle movement. Her finger found the trigger. She took a breath, held it, and fired. The report in the confined space was deafening, a physical blow. The man jerked and crumpled to the floor with a soft, final sigh. But Chiara had not aimed at his forehead. In the last possible millisecond, her arm had jerked minutely, a convincing pantomime of a traumatized woman's shaky aim. The bullet had taken the Sicilian in the shoulder, a bloody, non-fatal wound. He lay groaning, clutching at the blossoming stain on his shirt, alive. "Stronzo!" Dante barked, the viper striking. He moved with terrifying speed, slapping the gun from her hand, sending it clattering across the stone floor. He backhanded her across the face, the sting explosive and real. She tasted blood. "Sentimental fool," he snarled, the contempt in his voice a masterpiece of performance. He turned to the wounded man, drew a knife from his boot, and in one brutal, efficient motion, ended him. It was over in a second. He turned back to her, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a fury that was not entirely fictional. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and hauled her up the stairs, leaving the corpse and the gun behind. He dragged her through the corridors, not to her father, but to a disused service pantry, shoving her inside and closing the door. In the dark, punctuated only by slivers of light through the shelving, he crowded her against a sack of flour. "What were you thinking?" he hissed, his face inches from hers, the smell of blood and his anger enveloping her. "I was thinking," she spat back, her own fury rising to meet his, "that I am not an assassin. That a botched execution by a broken woman is more credible than a perfect kill. He'll believe I'm weak, not a plant. And your little display of corrective violence only sells it further." The anger bled from his face, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. The calculated risk, the manipulation of the expectation, it was something he would have done. For a long moment, they just stared at each other in the dusty gloom, breathing the same frantic air, bound together by the bloody secret they now shared. The moment stretched, taut and electric, the line between enemy and ally, between hatred and a terrible, twisted understanding, dissolving into something far more dangerous. The report, when it was delivered to Marcello, was accepted with a slow, considered nod. Enzo sneered, calling her weak, predictable. But Marcello's gaze held a new, speculative glint. A perfect killer he could use. A flawed, emotional creature he could control. The latter, perhaps, was more valuable. Her punishment for the failure was to be her brother's shadow, to learn the business from the ground up. It was a sentence that placed her in the heart of the syndicate's operations, and directly in the path of constant, suspicious scrutiny. Days bled into a week. Chiara moved through the villa like a ghost granted temporary substance. She attended meetings, her eyes downcast, playing the part of the recovering, shattered daughter. She listened, memorizing names, routes, account numbers, feeding snippets to Dante during their brief, staged encounters in the gardens or the halls, encounters always watched by Enzo's men or the ever-present silent maid. The tension between her and Dante was a live wire, commented on in whispers by the staff. The betrayed princess and the ruthless enforcer, circling each other with a history that crackled in the air. The climax of this delicate, deadly dance was the Gala della Rinascita, the rebirth gala. Marcello's idea, a brazen announcement to the underworld that his lineage was secure, his daughter restored. The villa was transformed into a temple of grotesque opulence. Crystal chandeliers blazed, an orchestra played Vivaldi, and the air thickened with the mingled scents of perfume, expensive tobacco, and latent threat. The guests were a living bestiary of the European criminal elite, men with watchful eyes and too easy smiles, women adorned in jewels that glittered like frozen tears. Chiara was the prize exhibit. Dressed in a column of emerald green silk that was both armor and bait, she was paraded through the crowd. Marcello presented her, a restored treasure. Enzo watched from the sidelines, a jealous guardian. And Dante, as Viper, was never more than 10 paces away, his dark suit blending with the shadows at the edges of the light, his eyes missing nothing. It was Enzo, fueled by jealousy and fine whiskey, who orchestrated the most exquisite torture of the evening. Midway through a waltz, he clinked a knife against his glass, calling for silence. "A spectacle," he announced, a cruel smile on his lips. "Our sister has returned. And who better to welcome her back to the dance than the man who found her? Viper. Dance with her. Show us all how protective you are of the family's interests." A hush fell, charged with anticipation. This was no request. It was a command, a test played out on the open floor. Dante's expression remained unreadable as he stepped from the shadows. He approached her, gave a slight, formal bow, and extended his hand. Placing her palm in his felt like laying her wrist on a heated blade. His other hand settled at the small of her back, a point of contact that burned through the silk. The orchestra struck up a tango. It was a perfect, malicious choice, a dance of passion, aggression, and intricate, lockstep control. They began to move, their bodies forced into an intimate, straining dialogue by the steps. To the crowd, it was a mesmerizing display of tension and latent history. To Chiara, it was a silent interrogation under blinding lights. "You're gathering the shipping manifests," he murmured, his lips near her ear as he dipped her, the movement fierce and possessive. "The warehouse in Bari is the key. The manifests are in Enzo's office, behind the Degas print. A safe behind it." She rose, spinning under his arm. "He has a new security system. Pressure plates under the rug. I'll get you the schematic." He pulled her back in, their bodies colliding for a brief, shocking moment. "The cartel meeting is set. 10 days. A ship called the Verita in the Bay of Naples." The information was lifeblood. But beneath the spycraft, the old wound pulsed. As the music swelled, carrying them into a series of intricate, demanding steps, his voice dropped again, stripped of its agent's cadence. "That day on the dock," he said, the words raw, meant only for her, "they had a sniper on you, Chiara. From my own agency. Vance's order. The deal was cut you loose or they deem you a risk and eliminate you. My severing you, my betrayal, it was the only thing that took their scope off your back. The world, the gala, the watching, hungry faces, all of it receded into a blur of light and sound. The truth of it, horrific and liberating, lanced through her. His betrayal had been a shield, however cruel its construction. The hatred that had sustained her for 5 years shifted, its foundation cracking, revealing not forgiveness, but a more terrifying landscape, a love that had survived its own crucifixion. The music ended with a final, dramatic chord. They stood frozen in the closing pose, chests heaving, his forehead nearly touching hers, the air between them vibrating with unspoken words and seismic realignment. The applause that erupted around them felt like a mockery. Later, long after the last guest had departed and the villa had settled into a watchful silence, Chiara moved. The information about the safe was a siren call. Using the shadows and the knowledge of the patrols she'd carefully mapped, she slipped into the deserted West Wing and into Enzo's private office. The Degas print of delicate ballerinas hid a modern, digital safe. She worked quickly, using a device Gabby had engineered years ago, her fingers steady. The safe door side open. Inside were not just shipping manifests. There were bundles of euros, bearer bonds, and a stack of files. Her own face stared back at her from the top one. Not as Chiara Rossi, but as Cassandra Reed. Photos of her bookstore, her apartment, her walking in the rain. Detailed reports of her daily routine over the past 2 years. And beneath it, a file on Gabrielle Silva, with a recent photo. Her blood turned to sludge in her veins. This wasn't Dante's file. This was her father's. A handwritten note, in Marcello's precise, elegant script, was paper-clipped to the front of her dossier. It read, "A falcon raised in the muse will always return to the glove." Her flight was merely an extended exercise. The prodigal daughter's return was always a matter of time. He had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. He had known she was alive, known where she was, and had allowed her fantasy of freedom, waiting for the moment to reel her back in. The gala, the test, the dance, it had all been theater for an audience of one, her. And she had played her part perfectly. The safe, the files, the note, they were not a discovery. They were a message. You are not a spy in my house. You are a puppet on my stage, and I have always held your strings. A cold deeper than any she had ever known seeped into her bones. She was not behind enemy lines. She was in the belly of the beast, and the beast had been watching her with a smile, waiting for her to realize she had never truly escaped. The game, she understood with a despair that threatened to buckle her knees, was not hers to win. It was hers to survive, and the rules had just been rewritten in her father's bloodless hand. The cold from her father's safe did not dissipate as Chiara slipped back into the shadowed corridors of the villa. It migrated inward, crystallizing around her bones, turning her blood to ice slurry. The note's elegant script was now a permanent scrawl across her mind. An extended exercise, her 5 years of quiet terror, of building a life from scraps of hope, had been nothing more than a controlled flight in a cage whose bars she'd never seen. The paranoia that followed was not a spike of fear, but a chilling, constant state of being. Every glance from a servant, every measured word from her father, every smirk from Enzo was now a potential confirmation that this was all a sick, elaborate game where the outcome was predetermined. And Dante, the man who had just reshaped the bedrock of her past on the dance floor, was he another piece on her father's board? Was the terrible truth he'd shared just another layer of the trap, designed to soften her, to make her pliable? She avoided him for 2 days, a feat of tactical evasion within the villa's confines. She threw herself into the role of the chastened daughter, following Enzo like a sullen ghost as he conducted his brutal business, absorbing details with a mind that now felt dangerously split, one part gathering intelligence, the other screaming that it was all being fed to her deliberately. The pressure, the isolation, the crushing weight of her father's omniscience, became a crucible. It finally shattered when she cornered Dante in the one place she knew was free of her father's obvious cameras, the old, cavernous wine cellar, deep below the holding cells where blood had so recently been spilled. The air was cool and thick with the smell of oak and fermented grapes. He was inspecting a crate, his back to her, but she knew he'd heard her enter. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. "My father has a file on me," she stated, her voice echoing slightly off the stone. "Photos of the bookstore. My apartment. Gabby. He knew where I was. He wrote that my return was always a matter of time." Dante went very still, then slowly turned. His face was in shadow, but she could see the tension in the line of his shoulders. "The leak," she continued, stepping closer, the words dropping to a venomous whisper. "Vance. You said she had a sniper on me. Who else? Did you know about my father's file? Is this all a double-cross, Dante? Am I the sacrifice to take down the Rossi syndicate from the inside, only for your agency to swoop in and take over the pieces?" She was trembling, not with fear, but with a rage born of utter powerlessness. "Tell me the truth. Not the agent. Not Viper. The man on the dock. Was any of it real, or am I just a useful idiot in a game you're all playing?" He moved then, closing the distance between them in 2 swift strides. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical force. "Look at me," he commanded, his own voice low and fierce. "The file is news to me. But it confirms what we started to suspect. There is a high-level leak, someone feeding your father information. It explains how he's always been a step ahead. Vance is compromised, yes. But this suggests the rot goes deeper, or your father's intelligence network is better than we imagined." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of pure frustration. "The truth I gave you at the gala was the only truth I had to give. They were going to kill you. I chose the only option that let you live. It was real, Chiara. It was the worst thing I've ever done, and it was real." She searched his eyes in the gloom, looking for the flicker of deception, finding only a reflected despair that matched her own. The paranoia didn't vanish, but it shifted, redirecting its corrosive energy. The enemy was not just in front of her in Naples, It was behind her, in the very organization meant to be her salvation. They were not a team, they were two cornered animals, backs to each other in a ring of predators. "We're on our own," she breathed, the realization settling with a strange, grim clarity. "Almost," he corrected. "We have Gabby. We need her. Now." The risk was astronomical. Contacting Gabby from within the villa was a direct violation of protocol, a thread that, if pulled, could unravel everything. But protocol was the language of the leak. They needed a language of their own. Using a burner phone Dante had smuggled in a wine bottle, Chiara sent a single, coded phrase to a dead-drop server Gabby monitored, *, the Falcon's muse has wrought in its beams. Need blueprint of the foundation. * it meant, the villa is compromised. Hack the task force servers, find the source of the leak. The wait for a reply was an agony that stretched over 48 hours, each moment spent under the smiling, watchful eye of her family a lesson in sustained terror. Marcello announced the final details of the cartel meeting. It would take place aboard the Verita, a sleek, private yacht, in international waters in 3 nights' time. Security would be extreme, a showcase of Rossi power. Chiara's role, Marcello declared with a paternal smile that didn't reach his eyes, would be to host, to charm the cartel's notoriously mercurial lieutenant. It was the ultimate test, placing her at the very epicenter of the deal. The night before the meeting, as a tense, electric stillness settled over the villa, the reply came. Not a message, but a data burst to Dante's encrypted device, a packet that self-deleted after 30 seconds. They huddled in the disused pantry, the screen's pale light illuminating their faces. The evidence was irrefutable, encrypted bank transfers from a shell corporation tied to the Cartel de las Sombras to a numbered account in Liechtenstein. The account was traced to a trust owned by agent Talia Vance. Intercepted, redacted communiques showed she had been feeding the Rossis just enough information to avoid major stings for years, in exchange for a future seat at the table of the consolidated narcotics route. She wasn't just a leak, she was a partner, playing both sides to orchestrate a takeover, eliminating the volatile Rossi family and installing a more professional, agency-connected regime. They were all pawns, Chiara, Dante, even Marcello and Enzo, in Vance's grand play for empire. The revelation was a cold shock, but also a perverse relief. The battlefield was finally defined. The mission was no longer just the syndicate, it was the syndicate and a rogue arm of the very force meant to destroy it. They were traitors to both sides now. Dante's face was granite in the faint light. "We can't trust the extraction team. Vance will have her own people on the water. The moment the deal goes down, we're not assets to be retrieved, we're loose ends to be trimmed. So we don't play their game," Chiara whispered, the plan forming in her mind like a shard of ice, clear and sharp and deadly. "We turn the game on itself. We use the meeting. We expose Vance to my father and the cartel. Let the monsters tear each other apart." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not an agent assessing a civilian, but an equal recognizing a ruthless, born strategist. It was the look her father had never given her. It was the look Dante might have given her in another life. He nodded slowly. "It's a suicide run. But it's the only move left." The grim solidarity of the moment birthed a desperate, fatalistic energy. The careful distance, the rehearsed animosity, the layers of betrayal and painful truth, they collapsed under the weight of the certain death that awaited them on the Verita. There was no future to protect, no cover to maintain in this dark, stolen pocket of time. There was only the raw, terrifying present. He reached for her, and this time, she didn't pull away. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing over the place his ring had once split her lip in the cellars, a gesture of apology and possession. There were no more words of explanation, no more spycraft. The kiss, when it came, was not gentle. It was a collision, a claiming, a communion of two people who had been stripped of everything but their will to survive and this desperate, fractured connection. It tasted of fear and fury and a love that had been twisted into a weapon but had refused to break. Her fingers clawed into his back, anchoring herself to the only real thing in a universe of lies. His hands were everywhere, mapping her as if to memorize her before the end, his touch both punishing and reverent. They made love there, in the dusty, dark pantry, surrounded by sacks of flour and tinned tomatoes, with the quiet efficiency of soldiers taking final solace. It was not romantic, It was necessary, a physical vow whispered through skin and heat and shared breath. It was the culmination of 5 years of longing and hatred, distilled into a single, incendiary act. When he moved inside her, it was with a groan that held her name like a prayer and a curse, and she met him thrust for thrust, matching his desperation with her own, drawing a line of blood down his shoulder with her nails. This was not a reunion, it was a forging, 2 broken pieces being welded together in white-hot desperation. Afterward, in the shuddering quiet, he held her tightly against him on the rough floor, his lips against her sweat-damp hair. This time, he vowed, his voice a raw scrape in the dark, I get you out alive, or I die with you. No more leaving. No more docks in the dark. She believed him. It was the only thing she could afford to believe. The fragile bubble shattered with the violent screech of the pantry door being wrenched open. Light from the hallway flooded in, silhouetting Enzo and 2 of his largest enforcers. Enzo's face was a mask of triumphant venom. He took in their disheveled state, Chiara's torn dress, the intimate tangle of their limbs on the floor, and a savage smile split his features. I knew it, he hissed. I knew the betrayal was too poetic. The lost lamb and the loyal shepherd. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Dante. You've been a busy little mole, haven't you, Viper? Did you think we wouldn't notice the encrypted traffic? That we wouldn't have our own ears on the line? He gestured to his men. Take him. The cartel likes to use traitors for shark bait, but I think we'll have some fun with him first. Let's see how long his agency training lasts when we start peeling the skin from his fingers. The enforcers moved. Dante was on his feet in an instant, a blur of motion, but they were ready. A vicious blow from a sap caught him behind the ear, and he went down hard. Chiara screamed, scrambling forward, but Enzo backhanded her, sending her sprawling against the shelves, cans clattering around her. Don't worry, sister, Enzo purged, as the men hauled the semi-conscious Dante to his feet. You'll have a front-row seat. Father will be so disappointed in your choice of allies. But after we break him, after he's confessed every detail of his little mission, you'll understand the true meaning of family loyalty. He leaned down, his breath hot and sour in her face. This is how we harden you, Chiara. This is the final lesson. As they dragged Dante, his head lolling, a trail of blood from his temple marking his path, out into the hall, his eyes found hers. They were dazed, but fiercely clear. In them, she saw no plea for help, no fear. She saw a single, silent, agonizing command, hold the line. Maintain your cover, The door slammed shut, the lock turning with a sound of absolute finality. She was alone in the dark again, the scent of their passion still mingling with the dust, the taste of his blood on her split lip. The plan was in ashes. Dante was in the hands of a sadist. And she was to bear witness, a princess in a tower, forced to watch the one person who had chosen her be destroyed to cement her place in the family. The crucible had just become a furnace, and she was locked inside. The silence after they dragged him away was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a thick, suffocating entity that filled the dark pantry, pressing against Chiara's eardrums with the force of a tomb sealing shut. The lingering warmth on her skin from Dante's touch turned to a clammy mockery. The taste of him, salt, blood, desperation, was now just a bitter residue. Enzo's command echoed, "This is how we harden you." It was not a threat, it was a prophecy her brother was determined to fulfill, using Dante's body as the anvil and her forced witness as the hammer. She did not waste energy on the door. It was solid oak, barred from outside. Her screams would be met with indifference or, worse, amusement. Instead, she moved with a mechanical precision, the cold that had taken root in her marrow upon seeing her father's note now spreading, freezing the panic, solidifying her into a single, sharp purpose. She righted her dress, wiped the blood from her mouth, and used the edge of a tin can to saw a strip from her silk slip. She bound her hair back tightly, a soldier's preparation. The Chiara who had trembled, who had performed brokenness, was gone. In her place was the final, unflinching incarnation of the Rossi name, a weapon that had been forged in escape and tempered in betrayal, now aimed with cold intent at the heart of the family itself. She worked through the night, using the hairpin Dante had given her weeks ago, a simple tool with a deadly design. She picked the ancient lock on the pantry's small, high window that opened into a vine-choked courtyard. The squeeze was tight, the drop jarring, but the shadows welcomed her. She moved through the villa's underbelly not as a ghost, but as a virus, using every secret passage and servant's shortcut she had learned as a curious, lonely child. Her destination was not the obvious one. She did not go to the modern cells below the wine cellar. Enzo would be too conventional for that. She remembered a place from a long-ago childhood scare, a disused lemon drying shed, converted during a prior conflict into a soundproofed interrogation room, isolated at the far edge of the grounds. It was a place of forgotten screams. She approached from the rocky hillside above, belly crawling through the fragrant, damp scrub. Below, the shed was illuminated by two portable floodlights, its single door guarded by a hulking silhouette. Inside, through the one high, dirty window, she could see the hellish tableau. Dante was shirtless, bound to a heavy wooden chair. Enzo paced before him, a riding crop in his hand. Another man, a specialist with a case of gleaming, horrific tools, waited in the corner. Dante's face was a mask of blood and sweat, but his head was up, his eyes open and defiant. Enzo's voice, though muffled, carried the cadence of a lecture punctuated by the sharp crack of the crop against flesh. Chiara's heart did not clench, it calcified. Every flinch on Dante's face was a datum. Every smirk on Enzo's was a coordinate. She watched for 10 minutes, timing the guard's patrol, mapping the shadows. Then, she retreated. She did not go for a gun. Guns were loud, traceable, the weapons of soldiers and enforcers. She went to the kitchen gardens, to the small potting shed. There, she selected two tools, a long, sharpened trowel and a handful of powdered quicklime, used to amend the soil, kept in a rusted tin. Weapons of the earth. Weapons of silence. She circled back, a wraith in the pre-dawn gloom. When the guard lit a cigarette, turning his head to shield the flame from the moist breeze, she moved. The trowel was not plunged, but drawn with immense, focused force across the back of his knees, severing the tendons. As he crumpled with a choked gasp, she flung the quicklime into his face. The chemical burn stole his breath and his vision, his screams reduced to a wet, agonized gurgle she silenced with the trowel's handle against his temple. It was not clean. It was agricultural. It was final. She took his pistol and his key. She did not burst in. She turned the key slowly, opened the door just enough, and slid inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. The scene froze. Enzo and the torturer turned, their expressions cycling from annoyance to shock. Dante's swollen eyes found hers. In them, she saw not relief, but a fierce, blazing warning. "Sorellina," Enzo drawled, recovering, a cruel smile spreading. "Come to watch the artistry? Or to finally pick a side?" "I have picked a side," Chiara said, her voice eerily calm. She raised the guard's pistol, not at Enzo, but at the torturer. She fired once. The report was cataclysmic in the confined space. The man dropped. "It's not yours." Enzo stared at the dead specialist, then laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "Brava. The Rossi blood sings after all. You think this changes anything? He's a traitor. He dies. And you will be punished, but perhaps you've earned a modicum of respect." "He's not just a traitor to you," Chiara said, shifting the gun to Enzo. "He's a traitor to Agent Talia Vance. She's the leak. She's been playing you, brother. Feeding you scraps to keep you fat and predictable. The deal tonight? She's made a side arrangement with the cartel. The Rossi syndicate is the target. You and father are the loose ends." Enzo's smile vanished, replaced by a volatile confusion. "Lies. A desperate tale." From the chair, Dante spoke, his voice ragged but clear. "Check the Liechtenstein account, Enzo. The one under the Bellerophon Trust. The wire transfers from Sombra Norte. Vance is the beneficiary. She doesn't want a partnership. She wants a takeover, with your family at the bottom of the bay." The specific details, the naming of the trust, landed with the weight of truth. Enzo's paranoia, his deepest instinct, was not that his sister was lying, but that he was being outmaneuvered by an outsider. The betrayal of an agent he'd never met was more credible to him than the loyalty of a sister he'd always despised. His face darkened with a thunderous rage. "We will verify this. If you are lying, his death will be a masterpiece. If you are not," he looked at Chiara with a new, grudging calculation. "The deal proceeds. But the terms have changed." He left then, storming out into the dawn to confront their father and verify the poison she had injected into the family's veins. The moment the door shut, Chiara was at Dante's side, using the trowel to saw at his bonds. His hands were a brutalized mess, but they closed around her wrists with desperate strength. "You shouldn't have come. The plan is Ash," she said, working frantically. "We make a new one. Now. On our feet." Freedom was a shaky, painful ordeal. He could barely stand, but he leaned on her, and together they stumbled from the shed, past the guard's corpse, into the cover of the groves. They had hours, not days. The cartel meeting aboard the Verita was a clock ticking down to detonation. Using the chaos Enzo's revelation would cause, they infiltrated the main villa one final time. While Dante secured weapons from an armory cache only Viper would know, Chiara went to her father's study. She did not seek more evidence. She uploaded everything, Vance's files, the shipping manifests, the encrypted ledgers, to a public, untraceable cloud server Gabby could access, with a single command: broadcast to all relevant authorities upon my signal. The journey to the Naples marina was a blur of stolen vehicles and circuitous routes, every shadow a potential enemy from either family or agency. They boarded a fast, unmarked launch Dante had arranged as a secondary escape vehicle long ago. As they sped across the choppy, gray waters of the bay toward the sleek, monstrous silhouette of the Verita, the sun began to set, painting the sky in washes of bruised purple and bloody orange. It was not a sunset, it was a staining. The yacht was a floating fortress. They boarded not by stealth, but by audacity. Dante, in a fresh, dark suit that hid his wounds, walked up the main gangway as Viper, bruised but unbowed, with Chiara on his arm, the princess, composed and lethal in a simple black dress. Their entrance into the main salon, already thick with the tension of high-stakes negotiation, caused a ripple. Marcello Rossi sat at the head of a polished table, the cartel lieutenant, a man named Cruz, opposite him. Enzo stood at his father's shoulder, his eyes burning with a volatile cocktail of rage and suspicion. Armed men lined the walls. And in the corner, posing as a liaison from the shipping insurance firm, stood Agent Talia Vance, her cool gaze sharpening to a needlepoint as she saw Dante and Chiara enter, alive and together. "You are late," Marcello intoned, his voice filling the opulent space. "We had complications to resolve," Dante said, his Viper voice a low hum of threat. He looked directly at Vance. Complications involving misplaced loyalties. The play was upon them. Chiara felt the pressure in the room swell, a psychic tsunami held back by the thinnest veneer of protocol. Cruz, sensing the shift, leaned back, a predator enjoying the sight of rival packs circling. Marcello's flinty eyes moved from Dante to Vance. "Agent Vance was just assuring us of the smooth waters ahead." "The waters are poisoned," Chiara stated, stepping forward. All eyes turned to her, the returned daughter, the silent prize. She spoke not to her father, but to Cruz. "Your partnership is with a ghost. The Rossi syndicate is compromised at its peak by the very agency meant to police it. The woman in the corner," she gestured to Vance, "has been siphoning your money and feeding you Rossi intelligence for years. Tonight, her plan is to let this deal conclude, then have her team storm the yacht, eliminate everyone here, and claim the route for her own consolidated network. You are not buying a partner. You are buying your own coffin." Vance's composure cracked. "This is the desperate fiction of a traumatized girl and a rogue agent," she snapped, reaching for her own weapon. But Enzo was faster. His paranoia, now given a target, exploded. "You," he roared, drawing his gun and aiming not at Dante or Chiara, but at Vance. "The Liechtenstein account. The Bellerophon Trust." The name was the spark. Cruz's men moved, weapons rising, not knowing who the enemy was but reacting to the threat. Vance's concealed team, positioned as crew, revealed themselves. Marcello shouted an order, and the Rossi soldiers responded. The salon erupted into a storm of gunfire and screams. Chiara and Dante hit the deck, a move of synchronized instinct. This was the chaos they needed. As the three-way firefight consumed the room, cartel against Rossi, Rossi against agency, agency against cartel, they became moving parts in the violent machinery. Dante, with a fighter's grace, took down two of Vance's operatives with precise, disarming shots. Chiara moved toward the main server hub, a discreet panel behind the bar. She plugged in the small device Gabby had sent, a digital screen that would scramble all communications and send the broadcast signal. She turned to see Enzo, bleeding from a shoulder wound, locked in hand-to-hand combat with a cartel soldier. Beyond him, Marcello had Vance cornered near the panoramic windows. Vance was speaking rapidly, trying to salvage her play. With a cold, final contempt, Marcello raised his own pistol. But Vance was faster, firing twice. Marcello Rossi fell, a dark flower blooming on his impeccable white jacket. The Don was dead. Enzo saw it. With a howl of pure, unadulterated grief and fury, he broke the cartel soldier's neck and charged across the room toward Vance. He didn't see the cartel lieutenant, Cruz, take careful aim. A single shot rang out, and Enzo crumpled mid-stride, his charge ending in a lifeless heap. The syndicate was headless. In the momentary lull of shock, Vance's eyes found Chiara's across the carnage. The agent's face was a mask of cold fury. She raised her gun. But Dante was a blur of motion, throwing himself in front of Chiara as Vance fired. The round caught him high in the chest. He staggered but didn't fall, returning fire and catching Vance in the throat. She dropped, choking, her grand design ending in a gurgle on the blood-slicked teak floor. The remaining combatants, leaderless, began to break, some leaping overboard, others fighting to the last. Dante sagged against Chiara, his breath coming in wet, ragged gasps. Signal, sent, he managed. Sent, she confirmed, supporting his weight, dragging him toward the deck. Behind them, the yacht was a charnel house, the legacy of the Rossis drowning in blood and seawater. Their escape was a nightmarish voyage in the small launch, Dante bleeding out in her arms as she piloted them through the dark, away from the sirens and flames converging on the Verita. She used every piece of field medicine he'd ever taught her, her hands slick with his blood, talking to him, cursing him, begging him not to leave her on another dock in the dark. They did not go to any agency extraction point. They went to the one place Gabby had secured, a private clinic in Malta owned by a doctor whose debts Gabby now owned. The surgery took 14 hours. Chiara waited, the cold inside her now absolute, a glacial core that nothing could melt. When the doctor emerged, his face grim but not hopeless, he said a single word, stable. The recovery was long, a silent, hidden passage of time in a sun-drenched, anonymous villa overlooking the sea. Dante's body healed, slowly. The damage to his hands remained, a permanent stiffness, a ledger of pain. They spoke little in those first weeks. Words were too clumsy, too laden with the ghosts of the salon. Their communication was in shared silences, in the touch of her hand changing his bandages, in the way he would watch her move around the room as if she were a miracle he dared not believe in. One evening, months later, as the Mediterranean sun bled into the horizon in a display that held no violence, only peace, he found her on the terrace. He stood beside her, his presence no longer a shadow of threat, but a solid, quiet fact. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine, not gunpowder or blood. "They're gone," he said, finally. The task force had been dismantled, Vance's conspiracy exposed. The Rossi syndicate was in fragments, its remnants fighting a war of succession while Interpol picked through the bones. Marcello and Enzo were buried in the cold, grand mausoleum that had always waited for them. There were no indictments for a dead bookstore owner named Cassandra Reed or a disavowed agent presumed lost at sea. "Where does a ghost and a traitor go?" he asked, echoing her own long-ago question, his voice rough with emotion and lingering damage. Chiara looked out at the endless sea, then at his hands, scarred but capable, then into his eyes, which held nothing but a truth she no longer feared. She took his hand, lacing her fingers carefully between his stiffened ones, a gentle, steadfast anchor. "Somewhere we can start over," she said, the first words of a new language they would build together. Not as a princess or a viper. Not as a ghost or a traitor. Just us. He brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, a vow without sound. The past was a country of graves and ash, but it was behind them. The future was an open, uncertain horizon, but they would face it not as fugitives from their stories, but as the authors of a new one, written not in blood or lies, but in the quiet, hard-won truth of a shared survival. They were not healed. They were not innocent. But they were, finally and irrevocably, together. Subscribe for more tales where love flickers in the darkest corners, where betrayal is a crucible, and the fight for a new dawn is never what it seems. The story may be over, but the hunt for the next dark romance is just beginning. Turn on notifications so you never miss a descent into the shadows.